Hey guys, tonight we begin with medieval emergency fixes, the kind invented at 3 in the morning while a city was burning and people were coughing. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Quarantine was not invented by doctors, scientists, or anyone wearing a reassuring white coat. It was invented by medieval officials staring at a city full of corpses and saying, "All right, something is clearly happening here. No microscopes, no medical textbooks, just a horrifying pattern and a strong desire to stop digging graves." Medieval port cities noticed it first. A ship arrived. Everyone got excited. Trade resumed. And then, within days, people started coughing in a way that suggested this was not going to end well. Bells rang, streets emptied. Someone inevitably said, "This didn't happen before the ship showed up." And just like that, humanity stumbled into epidemiology by accident. The solution was simple, brutal, and deeply medieval: delay everything. Ships were ordered to sit offshore and think about what they'd done. Travellers were kept outside city walls like socially awkward guests who arrived too early. Goods were left untouched, as if disease respected personal space and needed time to calm down. The famous 40-day waiting period wasn't sacred. It wasn't scientific. It was long enough for someone to start looking suspiciously unwell. If no one died after 40 days, congratulations, you were probably safe. If someone did, well, the problem often solved itself before paperwork became necessary. Being quarantined was miserable. You weren't sick, but you weren't trusted either. Food was delivered at arm's length. Guards watched you like you were a walking mistake. Conversations happened from across open spaces, shouted loudly enough for fear to echo back. Imagine being lonely, bored, and aware that everyone secretly hoped you'd either recover quickly or leave history quietly. Inside the city, quarantine created the illusion of control. People believed walls and waiting could protect them, which was comforting even when it wasn't entirely true. But sometimes it did work. Fewer people died. Panic slowed. Order returned just enough for everyone to pretend things were under control. And here's the important part. It worked often enough to be remembered. Quarantine stopped being a desperate emergency measure and slowly became policy. Observation turned into tradition. Tradition hardened into law. What began as medieval improvisation became the backbone of modern public health. Today, quarantine sounds clinical, responsible, organised. Back then, it was closer to, "Stand over there, don't touch anything, we'll see what happens." Not elegant, not kind, but effective enough to survive 800 years. Bureaucracy wasn't invented because medieval rulers loved forms, folders, or the quiet joy of alphabetical order. It was invented because during emergencies, everyone started shouting at once, and nothing worked. When wars broke out, harvests failed, or plagues emptied cities, medieval governments faced a terrifying realization. If nothing was written down, reality itself became optional. In early crises, rulers relied on memory and verbal commands. This went about as well as you'd expect. Who owed taxes? No one remembered. Who had already paid? Also unclear. Who owned which land now that half the village had fled or died? Excellent question. Arguments multiplied faster than rabbits with ambition, so officials reached for the most powerful tool available: ink. Lists appeared. Ledgers were created. Names were recorded. Properties were described in exhausting detail. Suddenly, survival required paperwork. This wasn't administration for efficiency's sake, it was damage control. When society started unraveling, writing things down was the only way to keep it from completely melting into chaos. Census records emerged not because rulers cared deeply about demographics, but because they needed to know who was still alive. Tax rolls weren't about fairness. They were about making sure someone, anyone, was still funding the kingdom. Court records multiplied because relying on witnesses during mass panic proved unreliable. Shockingly, frightened people lie. The medieval clerk became a quiet emergency worker. While soldiers fought and doctors failed heroically, clerks sat hunched over desks documenting reality so it didn't disappear. They preserved order with ink-stained fingers and a deep resentment toward anyone who said, "Can't you just remember?" People hated bureaucracy immediately. Forms were confusing. Rules felt arbitrary. Officials were slow. Nothing has changed. But bureaucracy had one unbeatable advantage. It worked when everything else stopped working. Once emergencies passed, the paperwork didn't disappear. Records proved useful. Written agreements reduced fights. Lists prevented duplication. Slowly, reluctantly, bureaucracy became permanent. What started as medieval panic management evolved into modern administration. Every permit, license, application and government form traces its lineage back to a time when rulers realized that yelling orders into a crowd of terrified people produced nothing but louder yelling. So yes, bureaucracy is annoying. Yes, it feels pointless. But it exists because medieval societies learned that chaos is far worse. And somewhere in history, a tired clerk just nodded and kept writing. Before emergencies forced everyone to cooperate, time in the medieval world was a suggestion, a flexible concept, a personal opinion. Noon happened when the sun felt like it was roughly overhead, and everyone politely agreed not to ask further questions. This worked fine, until something urgent happened and people needed to show up at the same moment. When cities faced attacks, fires, curfews, or food shortages, vague timekeeping became a liability. Meet at dawn was useless if dawn meant different things to different people. Bells rang early. Bells rang late. Bells rang whenever the bell ringer felt like it. Chaos followed. Sometimes literal chaos, sometimes just a lot of yelling. So medieval cities did something revolutionary. They standardized time, not out of scientific curiosity, but out of sheer frustration. If the city was going to defend itself, pray together, close gates, or distribute food, everyone needed to agree on when those things happened. Church bells became the backbone of timekeeping. Fixed hours were established. Bells rang at set intervals. Miss the bell, and that was your fault, not the sun's. Mechanical clocks followed. Large, inaccurate, expensive machines that still did one thing better than nature. They were consistent. And consistency, during emergencies, was everything. Standard time allowed guards to change shifts reliably. Markets opened and closed on schedule. Curfews could be enforced without arguments about shadows. Coordinated responses became possible. People still complained, but now they complained on time. Of course, no one liked this at first. Standardized time felt intrusive. People resented being told when to wake, work, pray, eat, and sleep. It felt unnatural, because it was. Medieval life had always flowed with daylight and seasons, not with bells screaming instructions at you from a tower. But once adopted, time discipline never left. It was too useful. Cities functioned better. Authority became easier to enforce. Emergencies became manageable instead of frantic. Fast forward a few centuries, and here we are. We schedule everything. We measure productivity by minutes. We panic if our phone battery dies because suddenly time becomes ambiguous again. And ambiguity makes us uncomfortable. All because medieval people once said, "We need everyone to show up now, not roughly later." Standard time didn't make life better. It made life controllable. And in emergencies, control always wins. Medieval cities did not invent street cleaning because they cared about beauty, comfort, or the emotional well-being of pedestrians. They invented it because the streets smelled like a warning sign. When disease arrived, filth arrived first. And when filth stayed, death followed close behind like an unwanted companion who refused to leave. For most of the Middle Ages, streets were multi-purpose spaces. People walked there, worked there, traded there, and very enthusiastically dumped waste there. Household trash, Animal droppings, butcher scraps, and whatever else needed to disappear were all generously contributed to the street. Rain was expected to deal with it eventually. Rain did not cooperate. Then came outbreaks, and suddenly officials noticed something curious. Neighbourhoods drowning in waste were also the neighbourhoods filling graveyards. No one understood bacteria, but medieval people were excellent at noticing patterns when the consequences were severe enough. So cities responded with what passed for emergency hygiene. Orders were issued. Residents were told to clear refuse. Gutters were dug. Waste was pushed away from living areas and toward rivers, pits, or the edge of town, which, to be fair, just moved the problem somewhere else, but at least it wasn't here anymore. This was not polite sanitation. This was aggressive cleanliness fueled by fear. Fines were imposed for dumping waste improperly. Entire streets were ordered to clean themselves at once, which was less coordinated than it sounds, and involved a lot of yelling. People complained loudly about the inconvenience, which is comforting because nothing about human nature has changed. Street cleaning worked just well enough to matter. Areas that removed waste saw fewer outbreaks. The smell lessened. Insects retreated. People stopped dying quite so fast. And once something reduces death, even slightly, it tends to stick around. Over time, emergency cleanups became routine. Cities hired workers specifically to remove waste. Rules became permanent. Infrastructure followed. Gutters turned into sewers. What began as medieval officials shouting, "Get rid of that before we all perish," quietly evolved into modern sanitation systems. Today we associate clean streets with order and safety. Back then, cleanliness wasn't about pride. It was about survival. A foul-smelling street wasn't just unpleasant. It was a sign that something worse was coming. So medieval street cleaning wasn't about making cities nice. It was about making them less deadly. And every time you walk down a clean sidewalk, you're benefiting from medieval people learning the hard way that rot and civilization should not share the same space. Medieval cities learned about fire the same way people learn not to touch a hot stove, by touching it repeatedly, and then acting surprised when everything caught fire again. Wood, thatch, narrow streets, open flames, and constant wind formed a perfect partnership dedicated to total urban destruction. A single spark could erase an entire neighbourhood. One careless hearth, one overturned candle, one bakery getting a little too ambitious. And suddenly the city was on fire in a way that felt personal. Flames jumped from roof to roof like they had a schedule. People didn't evacuate calmly. They ran, screamed, and tried to save items that, in hindsight, were deeply replaceable. After rebuilding the same cities for the third or fourth time, medieval authorities reached a revolutionary conclusion. Maybe this keeps happening for a reason. Emergency rules followed. Thatched roofs were banned in certain areas. Stone and tile were encouraged, or forcibly required. Buildings had to be spaced apart, not for aesthetics, but to give fires fewer opportunities to socialize. Hearths were regulated. Chimneys were inspected. Open flames were suddenly everyone's business. These weren't thoughtful urban reforms. They were trauma responses. People hated the rules. Stone was expensive. Tile was heavy. Spacing buildings meant giving up valuable land. Artisans complained. Landowners complained louder. Everyone complained until the next fire arrived and reminded them why the rules existed. Fire codes worked. Not perfectly, but noticeably. Fires still happened, but they didn't consume entire cities with the same enthusiasm. Neighborhoods survived. Insurance systems eventually emerged. Rebuilding became manageable instead of constant. And once again, the emergency fix stayed. Modern fire codes, sprinkler systems, building materials, spacing regulations, inspections, all trace their lineage back to medieval officials trying to stop cities from reenacting the same disaster every generation. The language changed. The enforcement improved. The frustration remained. We now think of fire safety as common sense. Medieval people thought of it as annoying interference until everything burned down again. Fire codes didn't make medieval cities safe. They made them survivable. And every time a building inspection annoys you, remember, it exists because someone, centuries ago, watched their entire city burn, and said, "Never again, or at least not this badly." Medieval hospitals were not places you went to get better. They were places you went so everyone else wouldn't get worse. Healing was optional. Containment was the goal. When plagues and epidemics swept through medieval cities, officials faced a familiar problem. Sick people were everywhere, and healthy people were becoming sick simply by standing too close. No one understood germs, but everyone understood proximity. Being near the sick was bad. Being far away felt safer. So medieval cities invented a solution that was less medical breakthrough and more strategic relocation. Hospitals were created as holding areas, places to put the ill, the injured, the contagious, and sometimes just the inconveniently coughing. These buildings were often outside city walls, downwind, or tucked into corners where no one important had to look at them. This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was triage on a societal scale. Inside these early hospitals, care was basic at best. Patients were fed, prayed over, and occasionally treated with remedies that ranged from mildly helpful to actively alarming. But the real function of the hospital wasn't curing disease, it was slowing its spread. If sick people were concentrated in one place, the rest of the city could keep functioning. Markets stayed open, guards stayed healthy, authority remained intact. People were terrified of hospitals. Being sent there felt like exile with extra coughing. Families avoided them until they couldn't. Once inside, patients were largely on their own, tended by religious orders, volunteers, or people with limited options and strong stomachs. And yet, it worked. Not perfectly, not kindly, but enough to matter. Cities with designated care spaces saw fewer uncontrolled outbreaks. Panic eased. Death became organised instead of chaotic, which sounds grim, but organisation was progress. Over time, something unexpected happened. Knowledge accumulated. Care improved. People noticed which practices helped and which made things worse. Hospitals slowly shifted from isolation centres into places of treatment. Emergency containment evolved into medicine. Modern hospitals are clean, scientific, and designed for recovery. But their ancestor was a medieval decision that went something like, put the sick over there, away from us, preferably behind a wall. Not elegant, not compassionate by modern standards, but effective enough to change history. Hospitals exist today because medieval societies learned that separating illness from daily life was the first step toward surviving it. In a medieval emergency, confusion was often more dangerous than the crisis itself. Fires, riots, invasions, outbreaks, all of them shared one fatal weakness. Nobody knew who to listen to. When everyone is shouting instructions at once, authority dissolves into noise. Medieval cities discovered this the hard way, usually while something important was burning. Early on, authority relied on reputation. That man is in charge. Worked fine until you couldn't recognize that man in a crowd of terrified people running in every direction. During chaos, titles meant nothing if they weren't visible. So medieval societies did something brilliantly simple. They dressed authority differently. Guards wore specific colours. Town officials carried distinctive symbols. Messengers had recognizable clothing. Soldiers were marked clearly, so civilians knew who was allowed to yell orders without being punched in the face. Uniforms weren't about style. They were visual shortcuts for obedience. This was especially critical during emergencies. If a fire broke out, people needed to know instantly who was directing evacuations. If a curfew was enforced, citizens had to recognize enforcement without debate. When plague hit, uniformed officials could deliver orders without stopping to prove their identity every 5 minutes. Uniforms replaced explanation. And it worked. People followed visible authority more readily, not because they trusted it, but because uncertainty was worse. A uniform meant someone had permission to act. In panic situations, that alone was enough. Of course, people resented uniforms immediately. They always have. Uniforms symbolize control, and humans famously dislike being controlled, right up until things fall apart. Then suddenly everyone wants very clear instructions from someone who looks official. Over time, uniforms became permanent. City guards kept them. Guild officials adopted them. Military clothing standardized. Authority stopped being personal and became institutional. You didn't obey that person. You obeyed that role. Today, uniforms still do the same job. Police, firefighters, medical staff, security. Their clothing signals authority, responsibility, and expected behavior. We respond automatically. We step aside. We listen. We comply. All because medieval people once realized that during emergencies, asking, "Who are you?" wastes time. Uniforms didn't make authority wiser. They made it visible. And in moments of chaos, visibility is often the difference between order and collapse. Medieval rulers didn't invent rationing because they enjoyed telling people no. They invented it because medieval emergencies had a habit of turning full granaries into empty promises overnight. Wars dragged on, winters overstayed their welcome, harvests failed spectacularly, and suddenly everyone wanted the same loaf of bread at the same time. This did not end well. Early on, cities tried optimism. They encouraged moderation. They asked people to be reasonable. Medieval history is very clear on how that went. When fear arrived, so did hoarding. The wealthy stockpiled. The desperate panicked. Prices exploded. Fights broke out in markets over grain that didn't exist anymore. Someone always tried to sell a sack of flour that was mostly wishful thinking. So authorities stepped in with the least popular solution imaginable: control. Rationing meant limits, fixed prices, set quantities, specific days for distribution. It wasn't gentle, and it wasn't fair in the modern sense, but it prevented total collapse. If everyone got a little, fewer people starved immediately. If supplies were tracked, panic slowed. If rules existed, order followed, grudgingly. Grain was the most tightly controlled resource. Bread shortages caused riots faster than almost anything else. Medieval governments learned very quickly that hungry crowds stop respecting authority. So they regulated bakeries, monitored flour supplies, and punished hoarders harshly. Not because they cared deeply about justice, but because bread riots were inconvenient and dangerous. Fuel was rationed too. Wood, peat, charcoal, anything that kept people warm or cooking became subject to oversight during shortages. You could burn, but not excessively. You could buy, but not endlessly. Survival required restraint, whether people liked it or not. People hated rationing immediately. They complained loudly. They accused officials of favoritism. They claimed the rules were unfair, oppressive, and badly managed, which, to be fair, they often were. But rationing had one undeniable advantage. It delayed disaster. Once emergencies ended, rationing systems often stayed in place. They provided predictability. They stabilized markets. They kept prices from spiraling every time something went wrong. Modern rationing during crises, food limits, fuel restrictions, supply controls, follows the same medieval logic. When resources shrink and fear grows, unregulated freedom collapses faster than regulation ever does. Rationing isn't about control, it's about survival math. And medieval societies learned painfully that without limits, emergencies don't just kill supplies, they kill order itself. Medieval cities learned a simple truth very early on. Nothing good happens after dark. Fires started more easily. Crimes became bolder. Arguments escalated faster. And when emergencies hit, nighttime turned mild problems into full disasters, with impressive efficiency. Before curfews, medieval cities tried trust. They assumed people would behave responsibly at night. This assumption lasted exactly as long as it took for the first drunken fight, accidental fire, or panicked stampede to prove otherwise. Darkness reduced visibility, multiplied fear, and gave bad decisions a confidence boost. So cities introduced curfews. Bells rang in the evening, gates closed, and movement stopped. If you were outside after the bell, you needed a very good reason, and, I felt like it, was not accepted. Guards patrolled streets. Anyone wandering without permission was questioned, detained, or encouraged to reconsider their life choices. Curfews weren't about morality, they were about containment. When fewer people moved, fewer problems spread. Fires were easier to spot. Crime dropped. Disease transmission slowed. Authorities could actually tell who should be outside and who definitely should not. Of course, people hated curfews immediately. Night was freedom. Night was privacy. Night was when you did things you didn't want witnesses for. Being told to stay indoors felt oppressive, infantilizing, and deeply unfair, especially to people who were absolutely planning to do something stupid. But curfews worked. Cities with enforced nighttime restrictions experienced fewer fires, fewer riots, and fewer unexplained disasters. The streets grew quieter. Emergency response improved. Order returned, at least temporarily. And once again, the emergency measure stuck. Over time, curfews became standard tools for crisis management. Plagues, wars, unrest, shutdown movement and chaos follow more slowly. Modern curfews use the same logic, just with better lighting and louder announcements. We still instinctively understand this rule. When something goes wrong, authorities restrict movement. Not because people are evil, but because panic spreads faster in the dark. Less movement equals fewer variables. Fewer variables equal control. Curfews don't stop emergencies, they slow them down. And medieval societies discovered that slowing chaos, even briefly, could mean the difference between recovery and collapse. So when you hear a curfew announced today, remember, you're listening to a medieval bell, still ringing centuries later, politely reminding humanity that nighttime is terrible for decision-making. For a long time, medieval society operated on a bold and deeply optimistic assumption. If someone said they knew how to do something, that was probably good enough. This worked fine for storytelling and farming advice. It worked much less well for medicine, construction, baking, and anything involving sharp tools or structural integrity. During emergencies, this optimism collapsed quickly. Untrained doctors killed patients with enthusiasm and confidence. Unqualified builders constructed houses that politely waited for winter before collapsing. Incompetent bakers produced bread that caused mass illness, riots, or both. And during crises, plagues, fires, famines, the damage multiplied. When survival depended on competence, pretending everyone was competent became inconvenient. So medieval cities intervened. Guilds were formed, not as cozy professional clubs, but as damage control mechanisms. If you wanted to practice a trade, you had to prove you knew what you were doing. You trained under a master. You followed rules. You demonstrated skill. If you failed, you were politely told to stop before you harmed anyone else. This wasn't about excellence. It was about reducing casualties. Medical licensing began as an attempt to stop people from experimenting on neighbours during plagues. Building standards emerged after too many emergency shelters collapsed. Food regulations followed repeated poisonings, and bread shortages that ended in violence. Licensing wasn't protectionism, it was survival. People hated it immediately. Unlicensed workers complained that rules were unfair. Masters guarded entry fiercely. Accusations of favoritism flew freely. And yes, some licensing systems became corrupt, restrictive, and frustrating, because they were run by humans. But licensing worked just well enough to stay. Cities with regulated trades experienced fewer disasters during emergencies. Buildings lasted longer. Food became safer. Treatments became less lethal. Once authorities saw measurable improvements, licensing stopped being temporary and became permanent. Modern professional certification, exams, permits, and credentials all descend from this medieval realization. Letting untrained people practice critical skills during crises is a bad idea. A very bad idea. We now take licensing for granted. We expect doctors to be trained, engineers to be certified, and food producers to follow rules. But those expectations exist because medieval societies learned, painfully, that trust me, I know what I'm doing, is not a safety standard. Professional licensing didn't create expertise, it limited disaster. And sometimes That's the best improvement civilization can manage. Medieval cities were not planned. They happened. People built where they could, added structures wherever space appeared, and stacked lives on top of lives until the result looked less like a city and more like an architectural accident. This worked fine in peaceful times. During emergencies, it was a nightmare. When fires broke out, narrow streets acted like wind tunnels. Flames leapt effortlessly from house to house, racing faster than anyone could run. When disease spread, cramped neighborhoods passed illness along like gossip. When armies approached, chaotic layouts made defense confusing and retreat worse. Walls alone were no longer enough. After repeated disasters, medieval authorities noticed something uncomfortable. The city itself was part of the problem, so emergency fixes appeared. Streets were widened, so fires had fewer places to jump. Open spaces were created to act as fire breaks and gathering points. Certain trades were pushed away from residential areas, not because of zoning aesthetics, but because tanners, butchers, and dye makers had a habit of making emergencies worse. This was urban planning born from regret. New towns were designed differently. Grids replaced winding alleys. Markets were centralized. Wells were placed strategically. Movement was controlled not for beauty, but for manageability. A city that could be navigated easily could be defended, cleaned, and controlled during crises. People resisted, of course. Wider streets meant less building space. Relocation meant expense. Regulations felt intrusive. Medieval citizens complained that planners were ruining the character of their neighborhoods, which is comforting, because humans have complained about urban planning consistently for centuries, but the results were undeniable. Fires spread more slowly. Disease transmission decreased. Emergency responses improved. Cities recovered faster. Once officials saw that layout influenced survival, planning stopped being optional. Modern urban design still follows medieval lessons. Fire breaks, zoning laws, public squares, traffic flow all descend from the realization that chaotic cities collapse faster under pressure. We now dress these ideas in language like efficiency and livability, but their origin is far darker. Urban planning didn't make cities pleasant. It made them survivable. And every time you complain about a one-way street or zoning restriction, remember, it exists because medieval cities once burned, sickened, and panicked themselves into understanding that space matters. Especially when everything goes wrong. For a long time, medieval law existed in a wonderfully flexible state known as whatever the loudest person remembers. Rules were passed down orally, enforced inconsistently, and argued endlessly. This worked fine until emergencies arrived and everyone started shouting at once. At that point, memory failed, tempers rose, and justice became whoever had the strongest voice or the biggest weapon. During crises, plagues, riots, famines, invasions, verbal law collapsed almost immediately. People argued over obligations, rights, exemptions, and punishments. Officials contradicted each other. Witnesses remembered events differently depending on stress, fear, or personal advantage. Courts turned into theatres of confusion where facts drowned under panic. So medieval authorities reached a surprisingly modern conclusion. Write it down. Written laws didn't appear because rulers suddenly became lovers of clarity. They appeared because ambiguity was dangerous. If no one could agree on the rules during an emergency, order vanished. Written laws reduced debate. They didn't eliminate injustice, but they shortened arguments, and in crises, time mattered more than fairness. Laws were carved into stone, painted on walls, copied into books, and posted in public places. Not everyone could read, but enough people could recognize symbols, seals, and official formats to know something serious was being declared. Written law shifted authority away from memory and toward permanence. Of course, people hated this immediately. Written laws removed flexibility. You could no longer argue, "That's not how I remember it." Officials could point to text and say, "It's right there." The law became colder, more rigid, and harder to negotiate with, which was exactly the point. During emergencies, written laws allowed cities to function. Curfews were enforced consistently. Punishments were standardized. Responsibilities were clarified. Even when people disagreed with the rules, they at least knew what they were breaking. Once crises passed, written laws didn't disappear. They proved useful. They reduced disputes. They allowed systems to scale beyond personal relationships. Over time, law transformed from custom into institution. Modern legal systems still rely on this medieval realization. Memory is unreliable under stress. Writing survives panic. Courts, contracts, regulations, and constitutions all descend from medieval cities, learning that yelling rules at frightened people does not create order. Written law didn't make medieval justice fair, it made it predictable. And in emergencies, predictability often matters more than perfection. Medieval people didn't need philosophy to understand scarcity. They needed winters. A few brutal seasons were enough to teach even the most optimistic town council that hope was not a food group. When harvests failed, roads froze, and trade stopped, cities learned very quickly that relying on "we'll figure it out later" was a strategy with a high body count. Early medieval communities lived dangerously close to the edge. Grain came in once a year. Fuel was seasonal. If something went wrong, war, bad weather, disease, there was no backup plan. People simply ran out of food and then ran out of time. This happened often enough that eventually someone had the uncomfortable thought, what if we didn't eat everything immediately? Thus, emergency stockpiles were born. Granaries were built to store grain beyond immediate need. Armories stored weapons and armor so they didn't have to be produced during panic. Fuel reserves were set aside for winter and siege. These stockpiles weren't signs of prosperity. They were scars from previous disasters. Every full granary represented a famine someone remembered too clearly. Stockpiling was controversial. People hated it. Grain locked away felt unfair when mouths were hungry now. Rulers were accused of hoarding. Corruption was common. And sometimes, yes, stockpiles were mismanaged or stolen. Humans have always been excellent at ruining good ideas. But when emergencies hit, stockpiles mattered. Cities with reserves lasted longer. Sieges failed. Winters became survivable instead of fatal. Panic slowed. Planning replaced desperation, at least temporarily. The presence of stored resources also changed behavior. Knowing supplies existed reduced hoarding. Reduced hoarding reduced violence. Order followed. Not because people became kinder, but because fear loosened its grip. Over time, emergency stockpiles became permanent institutions. Cities budgeted for them. Laws protected them. Access was regulated. What began as a temporary survival measure evolved into infrastructure. Modern emergency reserves, food, fuel, medical supplies, strategic resources, follow the same medieval logic. We still prepare for disasters the same way. Store now so we don't panic later. Emergency stockpiles aren't optimistic. They're realistic. They exist because medieval societies learned the hard way that winter always arrives, emergencies always repeat, and planning ahead beats improvising while starving. And every time a government warehouse quietly waits in the background, it's echoing a medieval lesson written in hunger and cold. Prepare now or pay later. Before public warning systems, medieval emergencies had a charming habit of arriving completely unannounced. Fires spread before anyone noticed. Enemies approached while people slept. Plagues crept in quietly. By the time danger became obvious, it was already personal. This lack of early warning cost cities dearly, and medieval communities eventually realized that surprise was their worst enemy. So they built noise. Church bells became the primary emergency broadcast system. Bells rang for fires, invasions, riots, curfews, and anything else that required immediate attention. Different rhythms meant different threats, though in practice, most people simply heard bell and assumed something terrible was happening, which, to be fair, was usually correct. Bells had one huge advantage. They didn't care who you were. Rich or poor, awake or asleep, inside or outside. If the bell rang, you heard it. No messengers required. No explanations needed. Sound travelled faster than authority. Flags and signals followed. Towers flew warning banners. Fires were lit on hills to signal danger across long distances. Horns blasted in coordinated patterns. Medieval cities built entire communication systems designed to scream, "Something is wrong," as loudly as possible. People learned to react instinctively. Bell equals action. Drop what you're doing. Look around. Follow instructions. Panic later. Of course, false alarms happened. Someone rang the bell too early, or too late, or because a goat knocked something over and nobody wanted to admit it. People complained loudly, but even false alarms reinforced awareness. Better to panic briefly than die quietly. Over time, public warning systems became permanent. They were tested, maintained, ritualized. Bells rang for practice. Signals were standardized. Emergency communication became infrastructure. Modern sirens, alerts, emergency broadcasts, and phone notifications are direct descendants of medieval bell towers. The technology changed. The psychology didn't. Loud, unmistakable warnings still override hesitation faster than polite announcements ever could. We like to think we're more rational now. We're not. We still respond best to clear, unavoidable signals telling us to stop whatever we're doing and pay attention. Public warning systems weren't designed to inform. They were designed to interrupt. And medieval societies learned that in emergencies, interruption saves more lives than explanation. So the next time an alarm startles you, remember, you're reacting exactly as intended. Just like someone centuries ago freezing in a street, looking up at a ringing bell, and realizing that something, somewhere, had gone very wrong. Medieval rulers did not wake up one morning with a passion for taxes. They woke up to wars, invasions, collapsing defences, empty treasuries, and the sudden realization that banners, soldiers, walls and food all cost money, immediately. And unfortunately, enthusiasm does not pay mercenaries. In calm times, taxes were predictable. Annoying, yes, but familiar. In emergencies, however, predictable revenue collapsed. Trade slowed. Harvests failed. People fled. And just when rulers needed money the most, the usual income streams quietly evaporated. So medieval governments invented a solution that still makes people groan today: emergency taxation. These weren't subtle. Special levies were announced for wars, fortifications, ransoms, crusades, and unexpected but extremely urgent situations, which somehow kept happening. Taxes were raised temporarily, at least in theory. Everyone was told it was just until the crisis passed. Everyone nodded skeptically. Emergency taxes weren't about fairness. They were about speed. Governments needed funds now, not after careful debate. Collection was aggressive. Resistance was punished. People complained loudly, which was allowed, as long as they paid first. And here's the uncomfortable part. It worked. Armies were funded, walls were repaired, supplies were purchased. Cities survived sieges that otherwise would have ended quickly and violently. Emergency taxation turned panic into action, at the cost of public goodwill, which medieval rulers considered an acceptable trade. Once the emergency ended, the tax rarely disappeared completely. Officials noticed something interesting. The system functioned. Collection networks existed. Records were kept. Revenue flowed. Why dismantle something that worked? So, temporary taxes became permanent categories. New precedents formed. Governments learned that extraordinary circumstances justified extraordinary funding, and that emergencies could be defined very flexibly. Modern governments still operate on this medieval logic. Special taxes, emergency budgets, crisis spending, temporary surcharges, all descend from the moment medieval rulers realized that survival requires cash and hesitation costs lives. People still hate emergency taxes. They always have. Complaints are tradition. Resistance is predictable. But emergency taxation remains one of civilization's most reliable tools when systems are under threat. Emergency taxes didn't make governments popular. They made them solvent, and once a state learns how to fund itself during panic, that knowledge never really goes away. It just waits patiently for the next crisis to arrive. In ancient Rome, purple was not fashion. It was authority made visible. To modernize, a purple garment might suggest creativity or eccentric taste. To a Roman, it screamed power, money, and a dangerous proximity to the state. This was because true purple dye did not come from a plant or a clever recipe. It came from the glands of sea snails, thousands of them, harvested, crushed, fermented, and boiled until the stench alone could knock a man unconscious. The result was Tyrian purple, a deep, luminous shade that did not fade with time. It only grew richer, like a dynasty that refused to die. Because of this, purple became less a colour and more a legal instrument. Roman law carefully dictated who could wear it and how much. Senators were allowed a narrow purple stripe, the letters clavus, running down their tunics. Equites, the knightly class, had to settle for a thinner stripe, the angustus clavus. Everyone else was expected to admire from a respectful distance. Full purple garments were forbidden outright, reserved for the emperor alone. Wearing one without permission was not bold, it was suicidal. This was not symbolic law, it was enforced. Purple implied imperial legitimacy, and Rome did not tolerate improvisation in matters of power. A man wearing too much purple could be accused of treason, even if he claimed it was just a gift or a misunderstanding. Rome had no patience for fashion excuses. If you looked like an emperor, you were treated like a rival, and rivals did not live long. The irony is that purple was not always elegant. Freshly dyed, it often looked dull or brownish. It only achieved its famous brilliance after exposure to sunlight. So wearing purple was also a performance. It had to be seen, admired, and recognized. Power in Rome was not subtle. It wanted witnesses. What makes this rule especially Roman is how casually brutal it was. Clothing became a shortcut for social sorting. You did not need to ask a man who he was. You simply looked at his tunic. One stripe, two stripes, no stripe at all. Purple did the talking, and it spoke loudly. In Rome, fabric could elevate you, protect you, or destroy you. Purple did all three. It crowned emperors, marked elites, and quietly warned everyone else to stay in their place. Silk entered Rome quietly, and immediately made everyone uncomfortable. It arrived from the east along long, dangerous trade routes, passing through hands the Romans barely understood, and cultures they half despised. By the time silk reached Roman markets, it was staggeringly expensive, feather-light, and shockingly revealing. And that last part was the problem. To Roman moralists, silk was not just fabric. It was corruption you could drape over your body. Traditional Roman clothing was heavy, structured, and modest. Wool and linen concealed the form, reinforced discipline, and projected seriousness. Silk did none of that. It clung, shimmered, and moved with the body in ways Romans associated with decadence, femininity, and moral decay. When a man wore silk, critics complained that you could see everything. When a woman wore it, they complained even louder. The Senate took this personally. Several sumptuary laws attempted to restrict or ban silk clothing altogether, especially for men. A Roman man in silk was accused of abandoning virtues, the masculine ideal of self-control, restraint, and gravity. Wearing silk suggested softness, foreign influence, and an alarming lack of shame. Seneca famously mocked silk garments as clothing that does not hide the body or even one's decency. This was Roman disapproval at its most polite. Yet silk kept spreading. The elite loved it precisely because it broke the rules. Silk whispered wealth. It suggested global reach, exotic taste, and the ability to ignore tradition without consequence. Roman women adopted it eagerly, layering silk with linen or using it as undergarments, scarves, and veils. Officially frowned upon, it was unofficially everywhere. Gold thread embroidery caused similar anxiety. Gold was permitted, but only in controlled amounts. Too much glitter suggested arrogance. Excessive decoration could trigger accusations of luxury crimes, especially during moral crackdowns. Under certain emperors, wearing too much gold could land you in court, not for theft, but for being visibly offensive. What makes this chapter deliciously Roman is the hypocrisy. The same senators who passed laws against silk often owned it. The same moralists who condemned gold embroidery accepted gifts wrapped in it. Rome never truly rejected luxury. It simply demanded that luxury know its place. Silk, like purple, became a test, not of taste, but of nerve. If you wore it, you announced that you could afford the fabric, the criticism, and the consequences. In Rome, that was the real fashion statement. The toga was not comfortable. It was not practical. It was not warm in winter or pleasant in summer. It was a massive, awkward length of wool that required careful folding, constant adjustment, and at least one free hand at all times. And yet, for Roman male citizens, it was compulsory. The toga was not clothing. It was citizenship made wearable. Only Roman citizens were allowed to wear the toga. Foreigners, slaves, freedmen, and women were excluded entirely. This meant that the toga instantly sorted society without a single word being spoken. If you saw a man in a toga, you knew he was a citizen. If he was not wearing one in the proper setting, you knew something was wrong. Public life in Rome demanded the toga. Courts, political assemblies, religious ceremonies, and official business all required it. Showing up without one was not casual. It was disrespectful. Different togas also carried different meanings. The plain white toga, the toga virilis, marked adult male citizenship. Boys wore the toga praetexta, trimmed with a purple border, until they came of age. Magistrates also wore this purple-edged toga, visually reminding everyone that authority was present. Candidates for office bleached their togas until they were painfully white, creating the toga candida, the origin of the word candidate. Roman politics was literally a whitening contest. Failure to wear the toga correctly could have consequences. Appearing in public dressed too casually might suggest moral laxity or political disrespect. Wearing a toga incorrectly, letting it slip or fold improperly, made you look incompetent or unserious. Roman elites practiced wearing the toga like a skill because it was one. You had to move, gesture, and even sit in a way that respected the garment. Rome expected you to suffer for your status. Ironically, many Romans hated the toga. Writers complained it was heavy, restrictive, and outdated. By the late Empire, people increasingly preferred tunics and cloaks in daily life. But tradition kept the toga alive long after practicality died. The toga was Rome insisting on being Rome. What made the toga powerful was not beauty, it was obligation. You wore it because the state demanded it, because your ancestors had worn it, and because not wearing it meant stepping outside the social order. In Rome, clothing did not follow life. Life followed clothing. In ancient Rome, footwear was not an afterthought. It was a declaration. Before a Roman ever spoke, his shoes had already announced his status, his job, and how seriously he should be taken. This was a society that believed hierarchy should be visible at ground level. Roman citizens wore closed shoes. Slaves did not. This distinction mattered. A barefoot man in the city was immediately read as enslaved, disgraced, or desperately poor. Footwear marked freedom as clearly as a legal document. Even freedmen, though technically citizens, were often recognized by simpler, cheaper shoes that quietly betrayed their origins. Color mattered as well. Senators wore distinctive black leather shoes with crescent-shaped ornaments on the front. These were not decorative flourishes. They were signals. The moment you saw those crescents, you knew a man belonged to the ruling elite. Remove the crescents, and the authority vanished. Shoes in Rome could elevate you or erase you. Magistrates and high officials wore red or reddish-brown footwear, visually separating them from the crowd. Soldiers wore the caligae, heavy hobnailed boots designed for marching and battle. These boots were so iconic that the future Emperor Caligula earned his nickname from them. He was literally Little Boot, named after the miniature military sandals he wore as a child among the legions. In Rome, even childhood footwear could become political branding. Indoor rules were strict too. Romans did not casually track street filth into private spaces. Shoes were often removed inside homes, especially in wealthier households. Slaves handled footwear, cleaning and storing it. A guest who refused to remove his shoes risked appearing rude or uncivilized. Manners, like everything else, were enforced through fabric and leather. Punishment could also be expressed through shoes. Criminals and disgraced individuals might be forbidden from wearing proper footwear, forcing them into public humiliation. Being seen barefoot was not just uncomfortable, it was socially devastating. It announced vulnerability and loss of protection under Roman norms. What makes Roman shoe rules fascinating is how precise they were. You could tell a man's rank without seeing his face. Look down, and the truth was there. Leather quality, colour, ornamentation, and condition all spoke clearly. In Rome, shoes did not just protect your feet, they protected your position, and if you stepped outside your assigned role, the wrong pair of sandals could betray you faster than any witness. In ancient Rome, what a woman wore was treated as a public statement about her character. Clothing was not just decoration, it was surveillance. Roman society believed that a woman's virtue, marital status, and sexual behaviour should be readable at a glance, and fashion was the tool used to enforce that belief. The most important garment was the stola. This long draped dress was reserved exclusively for respectable married women. Wearing a stola signalled that a woman was legally married, sexually respectable, and under the protection of Roman law. It was a badge of honour, but also a leash. A woman in a stola was expected to behave modestly, speak carefully, and remain within the boundaries of acceptable female conduct. The garment did not just mark status, it demanded compliance. Women who were unmarried, enslaved, or freed women did not wear the stola. Prostitutes were explicitly forbidden from wearing it. Instead, they were often associated with the toga, a garment otherwise reserved for male citizens. This was not accidental. Forcing prostitutes into the toga symbolically stripped them of feminine respectability and pushed them into a legal grey zone. Roman law made sure clothing itself delivered the insult. Adulteresses faced even harsher treatment. A woman convicted of adultery could be legally barred from wearing the stola forever. This punishment was devastating. It meant public exposure, lasting shame, and a permanent downgrade in social standing. Every time she stepped outside, her clothing announced her disgrace. Rome believed punishment should be visible, ongoing, and impossible to forget. Colours and materials mattered too. Respectable women were expected to dress modestly, even when wealthy. Excessive jewellery, heavy makeup, or revealing fabrics could trigger accusations of moral looseness. A woman could be criticised not for breaking the law, but for dressing like someone who might. Reputation in Rome was preventative justice. At the same time, elite women constantly pushed these boundaries. Hairstyles grew elaborate, fabrics grew finer, jewellery grew heavier. The rules were rigid, but enforcement often depended on class. A senator's wife could bend fashion laws far more easily than a poor woman ever could. Morality, like everything else in Rome, was flexible for those who could afford it. Roman women lived inside a wardrobe of expectations. What they wore determined how they were treated, judged, and remembered. In Rome, clothing did not express identity. It enforced it. In ancient Rome, hair was never just hair. It was a social signal, a political statement, and occasionally a legal issue. The way you wore your hair, or whether you had any at all, quietly announced your age, gender, moral standing, and loyalty to Roman values. For men, facial hair was especially loaded. Early Roman tradition favoured clean-shaven faces. Beards were associated with Greek philosophers, foreign customs, or personal mourning. A Roman man who suddenly grew a beard without explanation could invite suspicion. Was he grieving? Was he rejecting Roman norms? Or worse, was he trying to look like a philosopher without doing the thinking? Barbershops were public spaces of control. A man's first shave marked his transition into adulthood and citizenship. This moment was ceremonial. The cut hair might be dedicated to a god, reinforcing the idea that grooming was tied to civic life. To neglect one's appearance was to neglect one's duties. Sloppy hair suggested a sloppy citizen. Women's hair was even more tightly monitored. Modest styles were associated with virtue and marital respectability. Married women were expected to cover or carefully arrange their hair in public. Loose or elaborately styled hair could imply sexual availability or moral ambition, depending on who was judging. Roman writers spent an alarming amount of time criticizing women's hairstyles, usually as a stand-in for criticizing women themselves. Hair also played a role in punishment and humiliation. Criminals, adulterers, and enslaved individuals could have their hair forcibly cut or shaved. This was not about hygiene. It was about visibility. Hair loss marked loss of dignity. A shaved head made a person instantly recognizable as disgraced or powerless. Fashion trends could even become political. Under certain emperors, beards returned to favour, especially when philosophy became fashionable at court. Emperor Hadrian famously wore a beard, sparking a wave of imitation across the elite. Suddenly, what had once seemed un-Roman became acceptable, even admirable. In Rome, morality shifted when power did. What makes Roman hair rules fascinating is their inconsistency. Grooming standards changed with politics, class, and mood, but the principle remained constant. Your body was not entirely yours. It belonged partly to the state, partly to tradition, and partly to whoever had the authority to judge you. In Rome, hair did not grow freely. It grew under observation. In ancient Rome, jewellery was both a privilege and a provocation. Gold, gems, and pearls were admired, but they were also deeply suspicious. Romans believed that visible wealth should be controlled, measured, and kept within socially acceptable limits. Too little jewellery suggested poverty. Too much suggested arrogance, moral weakness, or worse, foreign influence. Sumptuary laws attempted to regulate exactly how much jewellery a person could wear. These laws were especially strict for women, whose appearance was constantly policed under the guise of morality. Rings, necklaces, earrings, and bracelets were allowed, but only in quantities that signalled elegance rather than excess. Of course, excess was never clearly defined. It depended on who was watching and how powerful you were. Gold rings carried particular meaning. For a long time, only senators and equestrians were permitted to wear gold rings. Everyone else had to settle for iron. The ring was not decoration, it was legal identification. A gold ring quietly announced that its wearer belonged to Rome's ruling classes. When the privilege was later expanded, the symbolism remained. Even as more people gained access, the gold ring continued to whisper authority. Pearls caused moral panic. Roman writers obsessed over them, especially when worn by women. Pearls from the Persian Gulf were astronomically expensive, and wearing them suggested wealth that bordered on indecency. Pliny the Elder complained that pearls had become a burden to the ears. This was not concern for comfort, it was concern for hierarchy. Pearls blurred the line between elite distinction and vulgar display. Men were expected to be restrained. A man dripping in jewellery risked being mocked as effeminate or morally weak. Jewellery on men was acceptable only when subtle and symbolic. A single ring. A signet seal. Nothing more. Anything excessive hinted that the wearer had lost control of himself, which in Rome was an unforgivable failure. Punishment could also be expressed through jewellery. Confiscation of rings or ornaments was a public stripping of status. Losing the right to wear certain items hurt more than a fine. It erased identity. What made Roman jewellery rules so effective was their flexibility. The laws existed, but enforcement bent around power. The elite broke the rules constantly, while the poor were punished for trying. In Rome, jewellery did not simply reflect wealth. It tested how much the system would tolerate you. In ancient Rome, grief was not a private emotion. It was a public performance with strict visual rules. Mourning clothing ensured that loss was visible, legible, and socially controlled. Romans believed that personal sorrow had to be expressed in a way that respected tradition, hierarchy, and civic order. The most common mourning garment was dark, plain clothing, often undyed wool. Bright colours were inappropriate, and decorative fabrics were avoided. Jewellery was minimised or removed entirely. The point was not comfort, it was recognition. Mourning clothes announced that the wearer was temporarily removed from normal social expectations. They were signalling grief before they ever spoke. Men in mourning might neglect grooming, growing beards, or allowing their hair to remain uncut. This temporary abandonment of appearance marked emotional disruption. But it had limits. Mourning was expected to end. Grief that lasted too long became suspicious, even offensive. Romans valued emotional control, and extended sorrow suggested weakness or manipulation. Women faced stricter expectations. Widows wore mourning garments for extended periods, sometimes years, depending on local custom and family pressure. Their clothing signalled chastity, restraint, and withdrawal from public life. A widow who dressed too richly or returned to bright colours too soon risked accusations of disrespect or moral looseness. Her wardrobe became a measure of her loyalty to the dead. Mourning laws also enforced class distinctions. Elite families could afford special garments and long periods of visible grief. Poorer Romans often had no choice but to resume normal clothing quickly, regardless of emotion. Public grief, like everything else, was easier when you had money. Ironically, mourning clothing could be used strategically. Politicians sometimes dressed in mourning to signal protest or moral outrage. Appearing in dark garments in public spaces could suggest that the state itself had suffered a loss. Grief became rhetoric. What makes Roman mourning rules especially revealing is their balance between empathy and control. Rome acknowledged pain, but only within approved boundaries. You were allowed to grieve, but not to disrupt society. Clothing kept sorrow legible, temporary, and polite. In Rome, even loss had a dress code. In ancient Rome, clothing did not just reflect status or morality. It could actively condemn you. Certain garments marked disgrace so clearly that no explanation was required. The fabric itself delivered the verdict. One of the most striking examples was forced clothing as punishment. Criminals, traitors, and disgraced citizens could be compelled to wear humiliating garments in public. This was not meant to hide wrongdoing. It was meant to advertise it. Rome believed shame was more effective when everyone could see it. A man dressed incorrectly, deliberately stripped of his proper attire, became a walking warning. Exile came with wardrobe consequences. A banished Roman lost not only property and legal protection, but also the right to dress as a citizen. Being barred from wearing the toga was devastating. Without it, a man visually ceased to exist within Roman society. He might still walk Roman roads, but symbolically, he no longer belonged to Rome. Enslavement erased clothing identity entirely. Slaves wore simple tunics, often coarse and undecorated. They were denied distinctive footwear, jewellery, or hairstyles that suggested autonomy. Their appearance reinforced ownership. A slave who dressed above his station risked punishment, not for theft, but for impersonation. Looking free without permission was itself a crime. Public executions and punishments often involved deliberate costume choices. Condemned criminals might be dressed in mockery, stripped naked, or forced into symbolic outfits that emphasized their alleged crimes. Clothing became theatre. Justice was not only delivered, it was staged. Even voluntary clothing could incriminate you. Dressing above your class invited accusations of arrogance or sedition. Dressing below it suggested shame or protest. Roman society watched appearance obsessively, reading meaning into every fold of fabric. There was no neutral outfit. What made this system terrifyingly effective was its speed. Words could be denied. Clothing could not. a glance was enough. Rome turned fabric into law because it reduced complexity. You did not need to investigate motives when the outfit already told a story. By the end of the empire, many of these rules softened or collapsed under cultural change. But the principle survived. Clothing was power. It rewarded obedience and punished deviation. In ancient Rome, justice did not always need judges. Sometimes it just needed the right outfit. In many ancient societies, tattoos were not decoration or rebellion. They were structure. They were a language written directly onto the body, one that could not be forged, traded, or conveniently forgotten. Before documents, seals, or written biographies, tattoos served as living proof of identity. They told everyone who you were without asking permission. What made tattoos powerful was permanence. Clothing could be removed, jewellery could be stolen, titles could be disputed, tattoos could not. Once inked, your body itself carried your social position. In cultures where honour, lineage, and achievement mattered more than wealth, this permanence was essential. Tattoos turned the human body into an archive. In many ancient cultures, not everyone was allowed to be tattooed. This is a crucial point modern interpretations often miss. Tattoos were frequently restricted to elites, warriors, priests, or individuals who had completed specific rites. Being tattooed was not a right. It was a privilege earned through survival, ritual endurance, or ancestral qualification. An unmarked body could signal youth, low status, or exclusion. The process itself reinforced this hierarchy. Tattooing was painful, slow, and often sacred. It involved blood, chanting, and ritual tools passed down through generations. Pain was not incidental. It was the price of legitimacy. Enduring it proved discipline and worthiness. The mark mattered because the suffering mattered. These tattoos were not random designs. They were coded systems. Lines, shapes, and placement all carried meaning. A mark on the shoulder did not mean the same thing as one on the face. Each position corresponded to role, rank, or spiritual alignment. To the initiated, the body could be read like a map. Importantly, tattoos could also exclude. In some societies, criminals, captives, or enslaved people were forcibly tattooed to mark ownership or disgrace. The same technology that elevated elites could permanently degrade the powerless. This dual use made tattoos socially dangerous. A mark could grant authority or remove it entirely. What unified these systems was control. Tattoos were not about self-expression. They were about visibility. Ancient societies wanted identity to be obvious and permanent. Tattoos solved that problem elegantly and brutally. In a world without paper records, tattoos were undeniable proof. Your body told your story, whether you wanted it to or not, and once written, that story could not be erased. Among the Scythians of the Eurasian steppe, tattoos were not decoration or fashion. They were elite insignia, reserved for those who held power, lineage, or exceptional status. Archaeology makes this clear. When frozen Scythian bodies were uncovered in the Altai Mountains, their tattoos were not scattered randomly. They were deliberate, complex, and unmistakably elite. Scythian tattoos depicted animals in motion, stags with twisted antlers, predatory cats mid-leap, birds of prey locked in eternal flight. These were not aesthetic choices. Each animal symbolized specific qualities admired by Scythian society: speed, dominance, vigilance, ferocity. To carry such imagery on your body was to publicly claim those traits as part of your identity. Placement mattered as much as imagery. Tattoos appeared on shoulders, arms, backs, and legs, areas associated with strength and mobility. Faces were rarely marked, suggesting restraint and hierarchy. Not everyone was entitled to carry the full visual language of power. The most elaborate tattoos appear on individuals buried with weapons, gold ornaments, and sacrificed horses. In other words, leaders. Scythian tattoos functioned as visual biographies. They recorded achievements, lineage, and spiritual affiliation. A warrior's body told a story long before he spoke. Among nomadic cultures where communities constantly moved and written records were impractical, this mattered deeply. Identity needed to travel with the person. Tattoos solved that problem. Pain again played a role. The Scythians used primitive tools, likely bone or metal needles, and natural pigments. Tattooing was slow and agonizing, but endurance was the point. A tattoo that hurt proved the bearer was worthy of what it represented. Weakness could not hide behind ink. What is especially revealing is who was not tattooed. Ordinary individuals, servants, and captives show little to no evidence of complex tattoos. This absence speaks volumes. Tattoos marked those who mattered. An unmarked body was not pure, it was insignificant. To modern eyes, Scythian tattoos look artistic. To ancient Scythians, they were unmistakable signs of authority. They declared power in a world without palaces or crowns. When you saw the tattoos, you knew who you were dealing with. On the steppe, ink replaced architecture. Power was not built in stone, it was carried in flesh. In Polynesian societies, tattoos were not symbols you chose, they were inheritances you carried. Tattooing was a sacred act that bound the living to their ancestors, transforming the human body into a genealogical record. The word tattoo itself comes from the Polynesian tatau, meaning to strike, a reminder that these marks were earned through ritual, not whim. Polynesian tattoos mapped lineage. Each line, curve, and repetition corresponded to family history, social rank, and ancestral deeds. Chiefs wore the most complex designs because their genealogy was the most extensive. Their bodies displayed generations of authority. To look at a heavily tattooed chief was to see his bloodline rendered visible. Placement was rigidly structured. Certain patterns belonged only on specific parts of the body. The thighs, hips, and lower torso often bore designs associated with strength and leadership. Facial tattoos marked noble status and spiritual authority. You could not simply decide to wear a pattern. Wearing the wrong tattoo in the wrong place was not insulting, it was sacrilegious. Tattooing was overseen by specialists who held immense religious authority. These tattoo priests memorized designs passed down through generations. Mistakes were unthinkable. A wrong line could misrepresent ancestry or offend ancestral spirits. Tattooing was therefore slow, ceremonial, and painful. Tools were made from bone or shell, tapped rhythmically into the skin. Blood was expected. Endurance was mandatory. Pain again served a purpose. Completing a tattoo demonstrated discipline, maturity, and readiness to carry ancestral responsibility. Children were not fully tattooed. Tattoos came gradually, marking life stages, achievements, and rising rank. An incomplete tattoo signaled an incomplete person. Refusal carried consequences. An adult man without tattoos was viewed as unfinished, untrustworthy, or socially marginal. Tattoos were not rebellious acts, they were obligations. A bare body suggested weak lineage or failure to uphold family honor. What makes Polynesian tattoo culture extraordinary is its precision. These were not decorative images, they were living documents. Every mark carried legal, spiritual, and social meaning. In Polynesia, ancestry was not hidden in stories or scrolls, it was worn openly. The body itself became proof of belonging, history, and power. In ancient Egypt, tattoos carried a meaning very different from the warrior elites of the steppe or the genealogies of Polynesia. Here, tattoos were closely tied to protection, fertility, and sacred function. They were less about public dominance and more about divine alignment. And notably, they were overwhelmingly worn by women. Archaeological evidence from mummies, especially female mummies from the Middle Kingdom, shows patterns of dots, lines, and diamond shapes tattooed across the abdomen, thighs, breasts, and lower back. These were not ornamental flourishes. Their placement strongly suggests ritual protection connected to pregnancy and childbirth. The marks sat precisely where pain, danger, and vulnerability were greatest. Egyptian childbirth was lethal. Infection, hemorrhage, and complications were common. Tattoos acted as permanent amulets, invoking protective deities such as Bez and Taweret. In this context, the tattooed body became sacred ground. The ink marked a woman as guarded by the gods, her flesh symbolically armoured against chaos. Tattooing in Egypt was likely restricted. These marks do not appear randomly across the population. They are concentrated among women associated with temples, dancers, priestesses, or elite households. This suggests tattoos were signs of ritual responsibility rather than social rebellion. A tattooed woman was not marginal. She was consecrated. The designs themselves were functional. Repeated dots may have created optical movement during pregnancy, visually interacting with the expanding body. Some scholars argue they served as focal points during labour, combining physical marking with psychological and spiritual support. Whether or not that was intentional, the symbolism is clear. These tattoos were activated by life events. Unlike other cultures, Egypt did not use tattoos heavily to mark rank in men. Male bodies were largely left unmarked. Authority was expressed through clothing, wigs, jewellery, and posture. Tattoos belong to the liminal spaces of life: birth, fertility, ritual performance. This distinction matters. It shows that tattoos were not universally about power in the political sense. In Egypt, power meant survival, continuity, and divine favour. Tattoos expressed that quietly and permanently. To modern eyes, Egyptian tattoos can look subtle or even decorative. But in their time, they were serious tools. They marked bodies that stood at the threshold between life and death. In ancient Egypt, tattoos were not statements. They were safeguards. In the classical Mediterranean world, tattoos carried a sharply different meaning. For the Greeks and Romans, tattoos were not marks of prestige. They were marks of control. Ink on the body usually meant you had lost something: freedom, honour, or legal standing. In Greece, tattoos were associated with outsiders and punishment. Thracians, Scythians, and other barbarian peoples were known to tattoo themselves, which Greek writers viewed with a mix of fascination and contempt. To a Greek citizen, a tattooed body looked foreign, excessive, and undisciplined. The ideal Greek body was smooth, balanced, and unmarked, a physical reflection of rational order. Ink disrupted that ideal. Because of this, tattoos became tools of humiliation. Criminals, prisoners of war, and enslaved people could be tattooed to mark ownership or guilt. These marks were not symbolic. They were administrative. A tattoo might state who owned you, where you came from, or what crime you had committed. The body became a label. Rome inherited and intensified this logic. Romans used tattoos to mark enslaved people, gladiators, and criminals condemned to hard labour. These tattoos often appeared on visible parts of the body, including the face or forehead, ensuring that shame followed the individual everywhere. Removal was nearly impossible. Disgrace was meant to be permanent. Ironically, Roman soldiers sometimes received tattoos as identification marks, usually on the hand or arm. But even here, the tattoo was not honorific. It was practical. It ensured loyalty and prevented desertion. The message was clear: your body belongs to the state. This is where the Roman view becomes especially revealing. Tattoos were not condemned because they were painful or permanent. They were condemned because they removed choice. A tattooed person had been claimed by an authority stronger than themselves. That authority could be a master, a court, or the empire. There is a quiet brutality in this system. While other cultures used tattoos to elevate identity, Rome used them to flatten it. Ink reduced people to function: property, criminal, soldier. To Roman eyes, a tattooed elite would have been unthinkable. Power was supposed to be removable, transferable, and symbolic. Tattoos were too final. In the classical world, tattoos told a simple story. If you were marked, someone else was in control. For the Celtic and Pictish peoples of ancient Europe, tattoos were not marginal or shameful, they were confrontational. Roman writers repeatedly described northern warriors as painted, tattooed, or stained with pigment, often emphasizing how unsettling this made them on the battlefield. To the Romans, these marks looked chaotic. To the Celts and Picts, they were deliberate declarations of identity and dominance. Classical sources describe warriors whose bodies were marked with swirling patterns, animals, and abstract symbols, sometimes enhanced with blue pigment derived from plants like woad. Whether all of these markings were permanent tattoos or a mix of tattooing and body paint is still debated. What matters is how they functioned. These marks transformed the body into a visible extension of territory, tribe, and lineage. Celtic tattoos appear to have been closely tied to warrior status. Not every member of society bore them. The most elaborate markings were likely reserved for fighters who had proven themselves in combat. To mark the body was to declare that it had survived violence and was ready to inflict it. A tattooed warrior announced experience before lifting a weapon. The designs themselves reinforced this message. Interlocking patterns suggested continuity and endurance. Animal motifs evoked strength, speed, or ferocity. These were not random images. They were symbolic armor. When a warrior entered battle, his tattoos moved with him, amplifying intimidation. The body became a living banner. What makes Celtic tattooing especially interesting is its relationship with land. Many designs mirrored patterns found in metalwork, stone carvings, and sacred sites. The same visual language appeared on bodies, weapons, and monuments. This created continuity between person, tribe, and landscape. To mark your skin was to claim belonging not just to a group, but to a place. Roman horror at these tattoos reveals their power. Romans described them as savage because they could not control them. These marks were not imposed by the state. They were chosen within the tribe, earned through action, and carried with pride. To Rome, this kind of bodily autonomy was threatening. In Celtic and Pictish cultures, tattoos were not accessories. They were declarations of readiness, belonging, and resistance. The body itself became territory that could not be conquered easily. Where Rome used ink to humiliate, these societies used it to challenge. Long before tattoos became associated with criminality in Japan, they carried meanings of bravery, endurance, and social identity. In early Japanese society, tattoos were not hidden. They were visible marks tied to region, profession, and personal resolve. Ancient Chinese chronicles describing the peoples of the Japanese islands note tattooed bodies used to signal belonging and protection, especially among coastal and river communities. Early Japanese tattoos often functioned as spiritual safeguards. Fishermen tattooed themselves to ward off sea spirits and dangerous creatures. The markings were believed to offer protection in environments where death was sudden and common. Much like amulets, tattoos were practical spirituality etched into flesh. Courage played a central role. Tattooing was painful and permanent, and that mattered. Enduring the process demonstrated self-control and toughness. In a culture that valued composure and endurance, submitting to tattooing was proof of character. These were not decorative flourishes, they were tests. Over time, tattoos also became markers of regional identity. Certain designs indicated where a person came from, much like dialect or dress. The body carried geography. In a largely oral society, this visual shorthand helped establish trust and familiarity among strangers. The shift towards stigma came later. As centralized authority strengthened, tattoos began to be used as punishment. Criminals were forcibly tattooed on the face or arms with symbols indicating their crimes. This was not a cultural contradiction. It was a deliberate inversion. What had once marked courage was now used to mark disgrace. The power of permanence was simply redirected. This dual history explains Japan's complicated relationship with tattoos. They were never trivial. Whether honorable or shameful, tattoos always meant something serious. They were tools of memory that could not be erased. Even when punitive tattooing fell out of use, the association lingered. Tattoos remained symbols of those who lived outside polite society. Yet beneath that stigma lay older meanings that never fully disappeared. Strength, endurance, defiance. In Japan, tattoos did not lose their power. They changed masters. What had once been chosen became imposed. What had once marked bravery became a warning. The body, once again, became the record of authority. Across many indigenous cultures of the Americas, tattoos were not abstract symbols or inherited decoration. They were records. Each mark documented something that had already happened. You were not tattooed for who you were. You were tattooed for what you had done. Among numerous tribes in North America, tattoos marked achievements such as success in war, endurance in ritual trials, survival of hardship, or fulfillment of social duties. A tattoo was earned, not granted by birth. This made the body a living ledger of experience. To read someone's tattoos was to read their history. Warriors often bore the most visible markings. Lines on the face, chest, or arms could signify enemies defeated, wounds survived, or leadership roles attained. These were not celebratory decorations. They were acknowledgements. A man without tattoos might be young, untested, or simply unproven. An extensively tattooed body commanded respect without explanation. Tattooing was also tied to spiritual transition. Vision quests, rites of passage, and communal ceremonies frequently culminated in tattooing. The pain was intentional. Enduring it demonstrated readiness to carry new responsibilities. Tattoos marked the moment when a person crossed from one stage of life into another. Women's tattoos carried equally serious meaning. In some cultures, they marked readiness for adulthood, motherhood, or ritual roles. Facial tattoos among certain groups symbolized maturity, discipline, and belonging. They were not imposed. They were requested and endured. Importantly, tattoos were never universal. Not everyone qualified. A body without tattoos was not incomplete. It was simply unread. Tattoos made experience visible, but absence did not automatically mean inferiority. This balance prevented tattoos from becoming empty fashion. Meaning was preserved by restriction. European colonizers misunderstood this completely. They often interpreted tattoos as primitive decoration or savagery. In reality, these marks functioned like medals, licenses, and certificates combined. They communicated trustworthiness in societies where written records were unnecessary. What makes indigenous American tattoo traditions remarkable is their honesty. You could not fake a tattooed achievement. You had either lived it or you had not. The body told the truth. In these cultures, tattoos were memory that could not be edited. The skin carried proof. Across ancient cultures, the unifying truth about tattoos is this: they were never about individuality in the modern sense. They were about responsibility. Tattoos bound a person to their past, their community, and their obligations. Once inked, the body could no longer pretend. It became a document that demanded accountability. Unlike clothing or jewelry, tattoos could not be removed when circumstances changed. This permanence made them dangerous and powerful. To be tattooed was to accept that your history would follow you everywhere. In societies built on honor, lineage, and reputation, this was not cosmetic. It was existential. Tattoos recorded ancestry, rank, courage, crime, protection, and punishment depending on the culture. Sometimes all at once. A single mark could signify elite authority in one society and absolute disgrace in another. The technology was the same. The meaning was controlled by culture. What mattered was control over the narrative. In cultures where tattooing was sacred, only specific people could authorize it. Priests, elders, or specialists guarded designs like legal codes. A tattoo applied incorrectly could misrepresent a lineage, offend spirits, or falsely claim status. This was not tolerated. The body was too important to be miswritten. Colonial and imperial societies often reversed these meanings deliberately. Tattoos that once marked honor were turned into tools of punishment. Marks that once recorded achievement were imposed to erase identity. This was not accidental. It was psychological domination. Taking control of the body meant taking control of memory. Modern tattoo culture often treats ancient tattooing as aesthetic inspiration. This misses the point. Ancient tattoos were not chosen because they looked meaningful. They looked meaningful because they were enforced by social consequence. Pain, permanence, and restriction preserved their value. In ancient cultures, you could not wake up one day and decide who you wanted to be. Your body reflected who you had proven yourself to be. Tattoos were earned slowly, painfully, and publicly. They demanded consistency between action and identity. Seen this way, ancient tattoos were sacred biographies. They told stories that could not be revised or rebranded. They tied the individual to something larger than themselves, and once written into flesh, those stories could not be denied. Anne Boleyn was not raised with the expectation of becoming a queen. Nothing about her early life suggested a destiny tied to England's throne. What it did suggest was something far more dangerous in the Tudor world. She was trained to move comfortably among power. From a young age, Anne was shaped for court life, not through inheritance, but through exposure, education, and proximity to influence. Born into the ambitious but not royal Boleyn family, Anne's value lay in her potential. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, understood that courts were schools of survival. He sent Anne abroad, first to the Low Countries and then to France, where she served in the household of the French Queen. This was not a finishing school. It was a political laboratory. Anne learned how monarchs spoke, how favours were exchanged, how reputation could be built or destroyed with a glance. She learned languages, music, dance, theology, and most importantly, restraint. France mattered. The French court was culturally refined, intellectually curious, and far more open to Renaissance ideas than England. Here, Anne absorbed humanist thought and early reformist religious ideas that questioned traditional Catholic authority. She also learned that charm was not softness. It was leverage. Wit could deflect danger. Silence could provoke interest. Attention could be rationed. Anne returned to England not as a naive courtier, but as someone visibly different. She dressed in continental fashion, spoke with confidence, and carried herself with a self-assurance that unsettled people. She was not universally admired. Some found her sharp. Others found her unsettling. But she was noticed, and in a Tudor court, being noticed was the first step toward influence. Crucially, Anne understood something many did not. Power did not only belong to kings, it flowed through access, conversation, and timing. She watched queens, favourites, and mistresses rise and fall. She saw how proximity to a monarch could elevate a family or erase it overnight. Anne did not arrive at court dreaming of a crown. She arrived equipped to survive proximity to it. That distinction matters, because when power finally turned its attention toward her, she was not unprepared. She had been trained for this environment long before England realized what kind of woman had returned. She was not born to rule. She was trained to endure courts, and that made her far more dangerous. When Anne Boleyn returned to the English court, she entered a familiar and dangerous ecosystem. Kings took mistresses. Women gained influence through intimacy. This was not scandalous. It was routine. What made Anne extraordinary was that she refused to play the expected role. Henry VIII noticed Anne sometime in the mid-1820s. At the time, he was already involved with her sister, Mary Boleyn, who had been his mistress and quietly discarded. Anne understood exactly what that pattern meant. Becoming another royal mistress offered short-term favour and long-term ruin. She had seen it before. She chose differently. Anne did not reject the king outright. That would have been reckless. Instead, she controlled access. She flirted, withdrew, and refused physical intimacy while maintaining emotional and intellectual presence. This was unprecedented at the Tudor court. Kings were pursued, not denied. Anne's resistance did something dangerous. It turned desire into obsession. Henry was used to obedience. Anne offered conditions. She insisted that her honour mattered, that she would not surrender herself without marriage. Whether this stance came from genuine belief, political calculation, or both is still debated. What matters is the effect. Anne shifted the balance of power. The king was no longer the sole decision-maker. He was reacting. Court factions took notice immediately. Some saw Anne as reckless, others saw opportunity. If she succeeded, her rise would be spectacular. If she failed, her fall would be fatal. Catherine of Aragon, Henry's queen, remained legally and morally secure at this point. Anne's refusal quietly threatened that stability. Anne also understood optics. She cultivated an image of virtue mixed with sharp intelligence. She engaged Henry in conversation, theology, and reformist ideas. She positioned herself not as temptation, but as a partner. This was radical. A mistress could be discarded. A wife changed dynasties. Henry's desire hardened into resolve. He did not want Anne temporarily. He wanted her legitimately. And legitimacy required something unthinkable: the removal of his queen. Anne did not yet have a crown, but she had already done something irreversible. She forced the King of England to imagine a future that did not include his wife. That imagination would soon shatter marriages, laws, and the church itself. By refusing to be a mistress, Anne Boleyn did not just protect her reputation. She set history in motion. Anne Boleyn's refusal placed Henry in an impossible position. He was married to Catherine of Aragon, a queen respected across Europe, and bound by a marriage sanctioned by the Pope himself. To marry Anne legally, Henry needed an annulment. What followed was not a private marital dispute. It was a constitutional crisis that would tear England from the authority of Rome. For years, Henry pursued papal approval to end his marriage. His argument was theological, that his union with Catherine was cursed because she had been married to his brother. But theology was only the surface. Beneath it lay desperation. Catherine had failed to produce a surviving male heir, and Henry feared dynastic collapse. Anne represented not only desire, but hope. Rome refused. Political realities made papal approval impossible. Catherine was the aunt of the most powerful ruler in Europe, and the Pope was effectively his prisoner. Henry waited, pressured, and stalled. Anne waited too, trapped in limbo. Each year that passed increased the risk. She was aging in a court that devoured women quickly. Anne's influence grew during this period. She surrounded herself with reform-minded thinkers who questioned papal authority and promoted the idea that kings answered directly to God. These ideas did not originate with Anne, but she amplified them. They offered Henry a way out. When Rome would not bend, Henry changed the rules. He declared himself the supreme authority over the church in England. This was not a sudden rebellion. It was a calculated transfer of power. With parliamentary support, Henry severed England's obedience to the Pope. The English church was born from frustration, desire, and politics. In secret, Henry married Anne. Later, she was crowned queen. The symbolism was enormous. A woman who had once been a lady-in-waiting now wore the crown of a newly redefined kingdom. But the cost was immense. Catherine was cast aside. England was spiritually divided. Europe watched with horror and fascination. Anne had achieved what no mistress ever had. She became queen. But the crown rested on unstable ground. Her legitimacy depended entirely on Henry's favour and the survival of the religious break she helped justify. The marriage had broken more than a church. It had broken precedent, alliances, and centuries of tradition. And once broken, nothing could be restored quietly. Anne Boleyn stood at the centre of a revolution she could not control. Anne Boleyn's coronation did not bring security. It brought scrutiny. From the moment she became queen, her value narrowed to a single expectation: produce a male heir. Everything else, her intelligence, her influence, even the religious revolution tied to her marriage, became secondary to her womb. England waited. Anne became pregnant quickly, and anticipation swept the court. When she gave birth, the child was healthy, intelligent, and unmistakably royal, but she was a girl, Elizabeth. The disappointment was immediate and dangerous. A daughter did not stabilize a dynasty. It postponed the problem. Anne understood the stakes better than anyone. She had displaced a respected queen and helped justify a religious schism. Without a son, her position was fragile. Still, she insisted publicly that daughters mattered, that Elizabeth would rule gloriously. Privately, she knew that confidence did not protect queens. Her subsequent pregnancies ended in tragedy. Miscarriages followed, including one devastating loss of a male fetus. Each failure was noted. Each whisper grew louder. At court, sympathy quickly turned into calculation. If Anne could not deliver a son, perhaps she could be replaced. Her relationship with the king began to sour. Henry VIII was impatient, deeply insecure about succession, and increasingly distracted. He had bent the church for Anne. Now he expected results. Anne, once the object of obsession, found herself criticized for her sharp tongue, her temper, her refusal to submit quietly. Anna's enemies multiplied. Conservative factions resented the religious changes she symbolized. Former allies distanced themselves. A new woman appeared at court, younger, quieter, and carefully unthreatening. Anne recognized the pattern instantly. She had used it herself. But Anne did not retreat. She argued, challenged, and continued to involve herself in politics and religious patronage. This only worsened her image. A queen who spoke too much was dangerous. A queen without a son was disposable. The tragedy of Anne's queenship lies here. She was still powerful, still intelligent, still influential. But none of that mattered anymore. The rules had narrowed. Produce a son, or be removed. Anne Boleyn was still queen, but she was standing on ground that was already giving way. Anne Boleyn did not fall because of a single mistake. She fell because her existence had become inconvenient. By the spring of 1536, the political weather around her had changed completely. She no longer represented hope. She represented risk. Anne Boleyn had made enemies from the moment she rose. Some hated her for replacing Catherine of Aragon. Others despised her reformist sympathies. Many simply resented her sharp intelligence and unwillingness to remain silent. As long as she was the king's obsession, these enemies waited. When his affection cooled, they moved. The miscarriage of a male child early that year was the turning point. It did not just disappoint the king, it freed him psychologically. The marriage had failed in its only indispensable task. Almost immediately, attention shifted to alternatives. Anne's former role as the woman who refused to be a mistress was now quietly transferred to another court lady. History was repeating itself, this time without Anne controlling the terms. What followed was not an emotional breakup. It was a legal assassination. Charges were constructed with chilling efficiency. Anne was accused of adultery, incest, and treason. These were not plausible crimes. They were useful ones. Adultery alone was not enough. Treason ensured execution and erased any chance of rehabilitation. The accused men were courtiers with little ability to defend themselves. Confessions were extracted or implied. Timelines were bent. Evidence was thin to non-existent. But that did not matter. Tudor justice was not about proof. It was about outcome. Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. From that moment, the end was inevitable. Trials were staged quickly. Verdicts were predetermined. Witnesses said what was required. The woman who had once controlled access to the king now had none. What makes Anne's fall so disturbing is its speed. One day she was queen. Within weeks, she was condemned. This was not chaos. It was choreography. Every step was designed to remove her cleanly and permanently. Anne understood this. Her reported composure during imprisonment was not denial. It was clarity. She knew the system she had helped reshape was now being used against her. Her rise had changed England. Her fall reminded everyone of something even more important. In Tudor England, proximity to power was never protection. it was exposure. Anne Boleyn was no longer needed, and in this world, that was a death sentence. Anne Boleyn's trial was not designed to discover truth. It was designed to end a problem. By the time she was brought before her judges, the verdict already existed. The proceedings were theatre, staged to give inevitability the appearance of law. She was charged with adultery, incest with her brother, and conspiring to kill the king. These accusations were deliberately excessive. Ordinary adultery would have allowed imprisonment or banishment. Treason required execution. The goal was not correction, it was erasure. The evidence was absurd. Dates did not align. Witnesses placed Anne in locations she could not possibly have been. Some alleged encounters were said to have occurred in public spaces under constant supervision. But Tudor courts did not require coherence. They required compliance. Anne defended herself fiercely. Contemporary accounts describe her as articulate, controlled, and incredulous. She denied every charge. She challenged inconsistencies. She reminded the court of her status and service. None of it mattered. The judges were nobles whose futures depended on the king's satisfaction. Justice was not blind. It was obedient. Her brother, George Boleyn, was tried separately and condemned just as swiftly. The inclusion of incest charges served a specific purpose. It ensured total moral destruction. Anne was not merely disloyal. She was portrayed as monstrous. This narrative justified not only her death, but the rewriting of her entire legacy. The speed of the trials was striking. There was no prolonged investigation, no serious defence. Sentences were delivered as formalities. The machinery moved too smoothly to be accidental. This was the state protecting itself from embarrassment. What makes Anne's trial especially grim is its intimacy. The men judging her had dined with her. They had benefited from her rise. Some owed their positions to her influence. Now they watched her fall without protest. Survival demanded silence. Anne was found guilty on all counts. The sentence was death. Even then, the king's mercy was staged. He granted her execution by sword rather than axe, a cleaner, faster method reserved for nobility. It was a final performance of controlled cruelty. The trial stripped Anne of her title, her marriage, and her humanity in the public record. But it also exposed something else. The Tudor state did not need truth. It needed closure. Anne Boleyn was no longer a queen. She was a problem that had been formally solved. Anne Boleyn's final days were marked by an unsettling calm. Imprisoned in the Tower of London, she moved through the rituals of condemnation with composure that unsettled observers. She prayed, joked darkly, and spoke with clarity about her fate. This was not denial. It was recognition. The machinery had finished its work. The execution was carefully staged. A skilled swordsman was summoned from France, a deliberate choice meant to signal mercy and refinement. An axe was blunt and brutal. A sword was precise. The distinction mattered to a court obsessed with appearances. Anne dressed carefully, removed her headdress, and addressed the crowd with dignity. She did not protest her innocence publicly. She did not accuse the king. She followed the script expected of a condemned queen. The blade fell once. Her death was swift. The crowd dispersed. Within days, the king was engaged to another woman. The message was unmistakable. The future would proceed without pause. But Anne's story did not end on the scaffold. That is the irony of her execution. The state could erase her body, but not the consequences of her life. The religious break that justified her marriage remained. The English Church did not return to Rome. The precedent held. Most significantly, her daughter lived. Elizabeth, the child whose birth had disappointed the court, would one day rule England longer and more effectively than any Tudor monarch. The Queen they had dismissed as a failure produced one of the most formidable rulers in English history. Anne's reputation shifted over time. To some contemporaries, she remained a seductress and heretic. To others, she became a victim of tyranny. Later generations would reinterpret her again and again. projecting their own anxieties and ideals onto her story. Ambitious woman, reformer, martyr, pawn, architect. What remains consistent is her impact. Anne forced a king to break a church, destabilize Europe, and rewrite succession law. She did this not through armies or titles, but through refusal, intelligence, and timing. Her power was personal, and that made it threatening. Anne Boleyn did not survive the system she helped reshape, but the system could not undo what she had set in motion. Her death closed a chapter violently. It did not restore the old order. In Tudor England, memory was as dangerous as ambition, and Anne Boleyn was never forgotten. In the years immediately following Anne Boleyn's execution, her name was treated with caution. Officially, she was disgraced. Her marriage was annulled, her title erased, her memory reduced to a mistake best forgotten. But history does not always cooperate with official narratives. Anne's daughter, Elizabeth I, grew up under a shadow that never fully lifted. She was declared illegitimate. She was removed from the line of succession. She was raised carefully, watched closely, and reminded implicitly of how dangerous royal favour could be. Yet in this constrained environment, Elizabeth absorbed the most important lesson Anne had never been allowed to finish learning: survival through restraint. Elizabeth inherited more from Anne than blood. She inherited intelligence, linguistic skill, political instinct, and a deep understanding of how power punished women who appeared threatening. Unlike her mother, Elizabeth learned to cloak ambition in patience. She watched the chaos left behind by Henry's marriages. She saw queens rise and fall. She learned what visibility cost. Ironically, the very qualities used to condemn Anne became Elizabeth's strengths. Anne had spoken too sharply, acted too boldly, challenged too directly. Elizabeth learned to delay, deflect, and remain unreadable. Where Anne forced decisions, Elizabeth postponed them. Where Anne demanded legitimacy through marriage, Elizabeth ruled by refusing it. When Elizabeth eventually ascended the throne, she inherited a kingdom permanently altered by her mother's life. England was no longer obedient to Rome. The monarch was the head of the church. Religious identity was national, not papal. All of this traced directly back to Anne's marriage and execution. Elizabeth's reign would later be celebrated as stable, brilliant, and triumphant. But that stability was built on lessons learned from catastrophe. Anne's fate became Elizabeth's warning manual. Every calculated silence, every delayed decision, every carefully staged appearance carried the ghost of her mother's story. Anne had tried to secure power through legitimacy and proximity. Elizabeth secured it through distance and ambiguity. Both strategies were responses to the same reality, a system that devoured women who misjudged its limits. In this sense, Anne Boleyn did not fail to produce a successful heir. She produced the most prepared ruler England could have had at that moment. Elizabeth ruled not despite Anne's death, but because she understood it. The daughter succeeded where the mother could not by rejecting Anne's legacy, but by surviving it. Anne Boleyn's greatest influence came after she was gone. Stripped of her title, executed as a traitor, and officially erased from royal favour, she should have vanished into history as a cautionary footnote. Instead, her life became a fault line that permanently altered England's political, religious, and cultural landscape. The English Reformation did not reverse itself once Anne was dead. The break with Rome remained. Monasteries stayed dissolved. The crown retained control over the church. What had been justified to obtain Anne became the new normal. Even those who despised her benefited from the system her existence had forced into being. That alone makes her one of the most consequential figures of the Tudor age. Anne also changed how queenship was understood. Before her, queens were expected to be obedient, fertile, and politically quiet. Anne violated every one of those expectations. She spoke, argued, sponsored reformist thinkers, and involved herself in policy. Her punishment was severe, but the precedent was set. Queens could be political actors. The danger was not participation. It was miscalculation. Her story became a warning embedded in Tudor culture. Women learned from it. Men learned from it. Proximity to power was seductive, but unstable. Favour could turn lethal overnight. Anne's life demonstrated that intelligence without structural protection was not enough. Ambition without insulation invited destruction. Over time, Anne's reputation softened. Protestant writers cast her as a martyr. Later historians reassessed the evidence against her and found it hollow. Modern interpretations often see her not as a schemer, but as a woman navigating an unforgiving system with limited options. All of these readings coexist because Anne resists simplicity. What cannot be disputed is this: England after Anne Boleyn was not the same country as before her. The monarchy's relationship to religion had changed. The idea of female political influence had expanded, even as it remained dangerous. And the Tudor dynasty's most successful ruler carried Anne's blood and her lessons. Anne did not live long enough to manage the world she helped create, but few people do. History often belongs to those who trigger change, not those who survive it. Anne Boleyn forced decisions that could not be undone, and she paid the highest price for it. She did not rule England for long, but she reshaped it permanently.